Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this third program in the 8-part series, Adirondacks for All, Identity and Environmental Justice in the North Country, jointly presented by the Adirondack Experience, the Adirondack Diversity Initiative, the Wild Center, and the Nature Conservancy. With virtual programs continuing throughout the summer, this series examines the history and present-day reality of the Adirondacks through an expansive lens of environmental justice. Tonight, our panelists will address the racial, class, and environmental dimensions of prisons and Adirondack wilderness, exploring the ramifications of the prison system for incarcerated people, residents of the park, and the Adirondack Park itself. My name is Eric Reardon. I'm the project director, and I'd like to start this evening's program by acknowledging that the Adirondack Experience is situated on the Aboriginal territories of the Mohawk and Abenaki people. Indigenous people continue to live in this region and practice their teachings and life ways. This program, titled Incarceration, Wilderness, and the Adirondack Paradox, features presentations from and a conversation between Anna Givens, Dr. Alice Green, and Dr. Clarence Jefferson Hall, Jr. Dr. Alice Green is the executive director of the Center for Law and Justice, a civil rights organization she founded in 1985. She has a doctorate in criminal justice and 3 master's degrees: education, social work, and criminology. The center provides community education on civil and criminal justice, legal guidance and advocacy, crisis intervention, and community planning and organizing around criminal justice, civil rights, and civil liberties issues of particular concern to poor communities and those of color. Dr. Green writes and lectures on racism and criminal justice and often does commentary and analysis for a number of newspapers and television and radio programs. Clarence Jefferson Hall, Jr. is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Queensborough Community College, City University of New York, and visiting instructor of sustainability studies in the Department of Social Science and Cultural Studies at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. His research investigates the intersectional histories of environment, race, and incarceration in the United States. Hall's first book, A Prison in the Woods, Environment and Incarceration in New York's North Country, was published by the University of Massachusetts Press in 2020. Anna Givens is a recent graduate of the University of Rochester in Rochester, New York, majoring in anthropology and Russian. During her time as a student, she conducted extensive research on incarceration, including the criminalization of mental health patients at a local hospital and the ways in which federal prison contractors lobby the government. Recently, she completed an honors thesis in anthropology exploring prison siting in the Lake Placid area. Throughout this evening's presentation, I would invite everyone to submit questions that they may have through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And now, at this time, I'll turn the program over to Jeff Hall.
Thanks, Eric. I'm going to bring up my slides here. All right. Good evening. I want to thank Eric again and his counterparts for organizing this series and for inviting me to participate. I also want to thank my friends Anna and Alice for their participation in this important discussion. It is impossible to disentangle the Adirondack environment from its long history serving as a site of incarceration. Between 1845 and 1999, the state of New York, and on one occasion, the federal government, opened more than a dozen prisons in the North Country, many of them located inside the boundaries of the Adirondack Park. Though state and federal officials repeatedly cited overcrowding in existing prisons as their rationale for opening new ones in northern New York, many of these same leaders also expected that penitentiaries would serve as engines of economic growth for a region stricken by stubbornly high levels of unemployment and poverty. The jobs that prisons created certainly improved the economic fortunes of many local residents, including those not directly connected to the prison system. However, the economic impacts that prisons created extend far beyond the bank accounts and ledger sheets of area homeowners and entrepreneurs. From the moment the first incarcerated worker flung an axe in the Dannemora woodlands in the winter of 1844 to 1845, the poorly compensated labor of imprisoned men has been pivotal to the shaping and reshaping of places built and unbuilt across New York's North Country. In addition to helping construct new prisons from scratch and fashion penitentiaries out of existing surplus properties, incarcerated men have labored and continue to labor on a variety of conservation, public works, and infrastructure projects in towns and villages across the region. The first cohorts of men incarcerated at Clinton logged nearby forests, mined and processed iron ore, and constructed badly needed roads in the isolated and undeveloped region. Development begat more development, and by the late 19th century, the price of New York's unrestricted pursuit of modernization was coming into focus. While air and water pollution posed distinctive health and economic risks, the rapid disappearance of New York's old-growth forest, especially in the Adirondacks, loomed as an existential threat in a society still dependent on forestry products. While the creation of the State Forest Preserve in 1885 and the addition of Article 14, the Forever Wild provision, to the state constitution in 1894 placed new limits on logging in the North Country, state officials simultaneously embarked on an unprecedented program of replanting forests on state land. As a source of cheap and easily controllable workers, Clinton State Prison would prove a pivotal, if unexpected, partner in New York's pioneering efforts in environmental conservation. The 1914 annual report of the State Conservation Commission shows that in 1912, the state delivered 143,000 pine trees to Clinton. And you can see this right here, Dannemora Prison, the number of forest trees delivered. Of that number, imprisoned men planted 108,250 on state-owned lands adjacent to the penitentiary, aiming to undo the damage created by incarcerated workers just 6 decades before. Thus, while incarceration inside the Adirondack Park, a place dedicated to healthful outdoor leisure and recreation, may appear to be a paradox, the experience of Clinton during its first 7 decades underscores the centrality of imprisoned workers to achieving goals, modernized infrastructure, and abundant forests deemed essential to an economy centered on wilderness tourism. This lesson was not lost on state leaders. What began as an informal arrangement between the Conservation Commission and Prison Department during the era of the conservation movement became in 1955 a formal agreement between the reorganized Conservation Department and Department of Correction. Legislation signed by Governor Averell Harriman authorized the construction of conservation rehabilitation camps on lands administered by the Conservation Department. There, young imprisoned men would engage in conservation projects like those undertaken at Dannemora 4 decades earlier. Commenting on this seemingly unconventional bureaucratic alliance, W.M. Foss, the director of the Conservation Department's Division of Lands and Forests, wrote, and I quote, "We do feel that our separate fields of endeavor have much in common, in that one deals with the conservation of human beings, while the other has the conservation of natural resources as its objective." The first of these camps in the North Country, known as Camp Adirondack, operated from the grounds of Clinton State Prison before its relocation to the Essex County hamlet of Raybrook in this facility in this photo in 1976. The explosive growth in New York's prison population following enactment of the Rockefeller drug laws in 1973 ultimately forced the reorganized Department of Environmental Conservation, the DEC, and Department of Correctional Services, DOCS, to adjust the parameters of the prison labor program they had jointly operated since 1955. Instead of building and operating camp facilities on DEC lands, men incarcerated in minimum security prisons would undertake a variety of conservation, public works, and infrastructure projects, sometimes for less than $1 per day, in communities located near the penitentiaries. The DEC and DOCS would still jointly operate the program, but its imprisoned workers would be engaged in projects that sometimes had little to do with environmental conservation. So what had changed? The aftermath of the civil rights movement witnessed the emergence of a new brand of hard right conservatism that favored criminal justice policies centered more on punishment and revenge and less on conserving human beings. It is no coincidence that this punitive turn in law enforcement coincided with skyrocketing arrests of impoverished men of color for both violent crimes and nonviolent narcotics offenses. By the mid-1970s, as the number of convicted men began to outstrip available cell space in New York's prisons, state leaders undertook a desperate search for surplus residential institutions that could be quickly and cheaply repurposed for correctional use. To mollify residents resistant to the idea of sharing their community with a prison, especially in places like Raybrook, Gabriels, and Tupper Lake, DOCS leaders dangled a lucrative offer. In addition to creating new prison-based employment opportunities, DOCS promised North Country communities the free use of imprisoned workers on conservation, public works, and infrastructure projects, saving cash-strapped local taxpayers untold sums on construction and repair work that might otherwise not be completed. While a small number of residents remained unmoved by the Corrections Department's overtures, I think it's fair to say that most homeowners in the North Country have accepted imprisoned men of color as low-wage workers in their communities. For nearly half a century, men incarcerated in the North Country's newest prisons, some of which have closed, have continued a tradition of low-paid, back-breaking outdoor work, first established when the area's original prison, Clinton, swung open its gates in June of 1845. Detailing each of the projects undertaken by imprisoned workers in the Adirondacks would take up more time than this presentation allows. They number in the hundreds, if not higher. I'll just use my slides here to show a few examples. So the Lake Placid Olympic Organizing Committee used imprisoned workers from Camp Adirondack and Raybrook to help with widening trails at Whiteface Mountain and to assist with construction work at Mount Van Hovenberg, the site of the bobsled and luge run and cross-country ski trails. And as this article from 1979 shows over here on the right-hand side, the estimate was that the incarcerated people completed about $200,000 worth of Olympic labor for a fraction of the price. The next few slides are images of the construction of the Winter Carnival Ice Palace in Saranac Lake, which incarcerated men helped build for over 4 decades. So this one from 1980, one from 2008, one from 2013. This is a document from the Department of Environmental Conservation archives that details just a 6-month period in 1989 of projects that incarcerated men at the former state prison in Gabriels engaged in. And you can see a variety of different projects. There were 14 different labor crews that worked out of Gabriels. And you can sort of look at these columns and see the different types of work that these men were engaged in. There was a forest fire in the Altona Flat Rock, which is in Clinton County 4 years ago, and incarcerated men helped fight that forest fire. So that's not a phenomenon that's unique to the state of California. Okay, this is my next section, so bear with me. The labor of incarcerated men, as I've just demonstrated in a sort of summary way, has literally shaped and reshaped the North Country environment. The blood, sweat, and tears of imprisoned workers are embedded in its built and unbuilt landscapes. And because so many of them, especially in the past half century, have come from impoverished communities of color, there is a Black and brown landscape, simultaneously visible and invisible, that overlaps the traditional map of the Adirondack Park. Recognizing the work of incarcerated people is important because the history of environmental planning and change in the Adirondacks has, until now, totally excluded the incarcerated workers whose exploitation has ensured the smooth functioning of daily life for residents and visitors alike. It is also important because there are many in the North Country who do not see these labor programs as exploitation. This is a problem, especially when we think about the sharp racial disparity separating the average North Country resident from the average imprisoned man. I've had the opportunity to share my research many times over the past 15 years. I've met many people who were involved with the prison labor programs I have just described. Many of these individuals, I believe, were sincere in their desire to make the lives of incarcerated workers more comfortable. There are many good and decent people in Northern New York who have been involved in this work. But this does not mean we can simply ignore the historical context within which prison labor programs developed. Over the years, I have heard a variety of arguments attempting to justify the exploitation of imprisoned workers. The work is good for them. They enjoy the work. They are better off in the North Country than in crime-riddled cities. They owe a debt to society. It's better that they're outdoors working rather than sitting idle in prison. The work teaches them valuable life skills. These programs save local communities money. The list goes on and on. Unfortunately, these arguments should sound familiar to students of American slavery. Similar positions justifying the brutal enslavement of African Americans were put forward as a matter of routine by white Southerners in the decades leading up to the Civil War. The exploitation of incarcerated workers in the North Country is firmly situated within a tradition of exploiting impoverished people of color that is deeply rooted in the culture, society, and economy of the United States. In an area replete with historical markers, monuments, and memorials, there are only a handful that recognize the place of incarceration in North Country history, and only one that explicitly acknowledges the work of incarcerated people. And I'm just going to show a couple of these. So this one, obviously, outside of the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora. Another one outside of Clinton, outside of what once was the state hospital for the criminally insane, which was later known as the Annex, which closed about a year ago. This small stone monument in Lion Mountain, whose prison closed a number of years ago, only dedicated to the employees and citizens of the community, even though the incarcerated people there did work outdoors. This is part of a mosaic you can find in Plattsburgh at the County Government Center, which depicts different chapters from North Country history, and actually does, as you can see, show the original wooden wall at Clinton Prison and the men here, the incarcerated men working on iron production. But this is the only of this small number of historical markers that actually mentions the work of incarcerated people. And this can be found at the Adirondack Park Visitors Interpretive Center in Paul Smith's. And in case this is hard to read, I can read this. It says, in grateful recognition of the correctional staff and inmates of the Department of Correctional Services, Camp Gabriel's, who constructed the Adirondack Park Visitor Interpretive Center Trail System 1986 to 1989. Acknowledging the exploitation at the heart of these prison labor programs and memorializing the labor itself would be an important step toward making the Adirondacks a more environmentally just place, a place that truly is for all. Thank you for listening. And I am going to turn things over now to my friend Anna.
And let me just pull up my presentation here. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Jeff, for such a fascinating and informative presentation. Thank you to Eric and the other organizers of this very important event, and thank you to Alice for also being a part of this. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say later on this evening. As Eric mentioned, my name is Anna Givens, and I'm a graduate of the University of Rochester. Recently, I completed an honors thesis in anthropology, building on about a year of research in the Adirondacks and more specifically Lake Placid. Due to the notable presence of prisons in the Adirondacks, both in the present day and historically, I was interested in understanding the impacts of correctional facilities on Adirondack communities and the ways in which correctional facilities were perceived by local townspeople. And this was kind of this question here on the slide: what kind of relationship do Adirondack prisons have with the communities they are a part of, was kind of my guiding question in my research. Focus of my research was on FCI Raybrook, a federal prison that originally served as athlete housing in the 1980 Winter Olympics in Lake Placid, though I also did some research regarding the Adirondack Correctional Facility that's also in Raybrook, which is a state prison. After speaking with a wide variety of individuals who were connected to not only FCI Raybrook, but Adirondack prisons in general, including journalists, activists, corrections officers, professors, and community members, I argued that the relationship between Raybrook and FCI Raybrook was multifaceted and influenced by a number of factors that either encouraged or discouraged. Some of these factors that I discovered include rapidly changing federal prison policy, the stigmatization of corrections work, the trauma-producing aspects of prisons, both on inmates and surrounding communities, and recent work done by activists and community members. These are some of the factors that define and redefine the public's relationship with this prison that I found specifically in my research. For the purposes of my presentation tonight, I will only discuss the last three findings I made, which are the stigmatization of corrections work, the trauma-producing aspects of prisons, and Adirondacks-based activism. I only want to speak about these three factors because my interlocutors, the people that I spoke with, felt that they are applicable to Adirondacks communities other than Raybrook and Lake Placid. In fact, several people I interviewed were from different Adirondack communities, yet still described similar experiences to me. The impact of federal prisons policy pertains mostly to FCI Raybrook, as it is the only federal prison in the Adirondacks region. And I wanted the focus of this presentation to be more about the Adirondacks in general, rather than one specific prison. I also want to emphasize that when I say that I will be sharing my findings with you, what I really mean is that I will be sharing stories with you. What you will hear tonight from me will largely be stories. Stories about families, stories about communities, stories about prisons, and stories about the Adirondacks, all from people who live or have lived in this region. As mentioned, many of my interlocutors felt that there was a stigma surrounding corrections work in the Adirondacks, and that this stigmatization is an obstacle in engaging with Adirondack prisons or in discussing their impacts on Adirondack life. One of the first people that I interviewed was Martha Swann, the founder and executive director of John Brown Lives, which is an Adirondacks-based activist organization that seeks to support the families of incarcerated people, as well as educate Adirondacks communities about the role of prisons in New York State history. It was Martha who first described the social stigma surrounding corrections work to me. She told me a story about a man whom she met through her work with John Brown Lives. She knew that he worked in the prison, so she always assumed that he was a correctional officer. But when she spoke with him, she learned that he actually referred to himself as a rec specialist. He told her, "You could walk into any bar and be surrounded by corrections officers, but not a single one will tell you that he's a CO or a corrections officer." Even though many of these Adirondack communities are very dependent on corrections job and prisons labor, there is an unwillingness to speak about prison work. As I learned from speaking with Martha, a lot of corrections officers also do contracting work on the side to supplement their income. Martha told me, if you were to ask one of these men what they do for a living, they would say that they were a carpenter or an electrician rather than a corrections officer. Martha's account describes the ways in which the stigma surrounding prisons can exist even beyond the boundaries of the prison, extending across the prison's immediate spatial proximity. Many of my interlocutors felt prisons and prison work was too much of a taboo to speak about openly, resulting in an extreme reluctance to speak about prisons in any capacity, even if it is a vital part of daily life. However, when prisons and prison work are not talked about, the prison is rendered invisible, regardless of its role in the town, which, in my interlocutors' opinions, limits the community's willingness to meaningfully engage with prisons. In facilities such as the Adirondack Correctional Facility, or FCI Raybrook, my research site, where the view of the buildings is obstructed by trees, this invisibility of the prison is amplified as these facilities become physically invisible as well as socially invisible. I also spoke with James, a student at a local college whose father was a corrections officer for most of his life and worked in various prisons across New York State, including in the Adirondacks. James reiterated Martha's observations about the stigmatization of corrections work, explaining that his father was always very private about his work in corrections and, like the correctional officers described by Martha, told people he was a carpenter. Although the state gave correctional officers stickers to put on their vehicles to indicate they were COs, James told me that his father always refused to do so, saying, "Why should I put a target on my back?" James told me that he thinks that his father was not only afraid of the danger of potentially being targeted by former inmates, but was also worried about the way people would perceive him, knowing his line of work. Even though corrections officers do not speak very much about their work, jobs in corrections were seen as very beneficial to the employees, according to James, because it is one of the only jobs in impoverished towns that offer state benefits, healthcare, dental care, and vision care for people who do not have much education beyond a high school diploma. Corrections positions were so desirable that James even considered working in corrections himself. He had just gotten out of high school and he couldn't find a job that paid him enough to live on, so he applied to work as a corrections officer. He filled out all the paperwork and took all the necessary tests, but didn't tell anyone because, according to James, that's not the kind of thing you talk about until you get into that room and see a bunch of people you know who are also applying to work in prisons. Then it's like, Jared, John, Tiffany, Brittany, good to see you. James's description is very telling and highlights some of the contradictions of working in corrections in small towns. On the one hand, corrections work provides a steady income and benefits that many other employers cannot afford to offer. Yet there is a strong reluctance to discuss this type of work. I cannot say for certain why corrections work is so stigmatized, and my interlocutors struggle to identify a reason as well. Some suggested a disdain for government work, negative perceptions of inmates, or the stressful and traumatic aspects of the job. Regardless of the reason, if the stigmatization of corrections work turns prisons into invisible objects that cannot be discussed, then the people incarcerated inside these prisons are also rendered invisible, as their presence in the town goes unacknowledged. However, the lack of conversation about Adirondack prisons goes beyond social stigma. According to almost all my interlocutors, the presence of prisons in Adirondack towns is actually trauma-producing. I spoke with Joseph, James's father, who worked as a corrections officer, and explained some of the ways working in corrections negatively impacted his life and the lives of his colleagues. He emphasized the proliferation of addiction and alcoholism among former COs that continues into retirement and the very stressful aspects of the job. That's why COs have such high divorce rates. They have the second highest suicide rate of any profession in America, he told me. The trauma experienced by Joseph and other corrections officers is not just felt by COs. In towns where so many community members work in high-stress jobs that have high rates of divorce, addiction, and suicide, the trauma experienced by corrections workers is also shared by their family members and other loved ones, even if they do not work in corrections themselves. Furthermore, when a town becomes economically dependent on the presence of a prison, the closing of a prison can be very traumatic as well. In small towns where 5 to 6% of the population is employed by a prison or prisons, hundreds of townspeople lose their jobs. Although the corrections workers get a chance to transfer to other facilities in New York, it dislocates them from the community. Joseph told me that he worked for 5 years in various Adirondack prisons before he was close enough to home to sleep in his own bed. This dislocation of corrections workers is amplified by what his son James calls an exodus of young people out of Adirondack communities in search of better opportunities. The simultaneity of these processes creates a drain on Adirondack communities, both of older community members who can serve as role models for younger generations, and of young people who can bring new ideas and contributions to the future of their hometowns. In addition to the loss of jobs and the displacement of community members, closures of prisons cause loss of tax returns, which would normally go to schools and school lunches, as James told me. According to James, because prisons are the dominant industry in many Adirondack towns, local governments get a significant portion of funding for school, infrastructure, and public health from money that is made through prisons. Therefore, in Adirondack prison towns, there is so much more at stake with the closure of prisons than just jobs, as the budgets of local governments are inextricably linked to prison as an industry. When prisons close down, it is devastating for local communities who, despite not necessarily viewing prisons as part of the Adirondack identity, rally around prisons when they are closed, as evidenced by demonstrations in Mariah at the end of 2021, in an attempt to prevent the closure of the Mariah Shock facility. Now, I'm not trying to say that all Adirondack residents are anti-prison, because that would be an oversimplification. Some of my interlocutors, despite experiencing the detrimental effects of the presence of Adirondack prisons, also identified with prisons to an extent. At first glance, it seems highly paradoxical that so many people would identify with the entity that is injuring them and their communities. However, corrections jobs in the corrections industry are much more than just a source of employment. They're also an indicator of value and a means of self-determination, as evidenced by James, who explained that his father became a corrections officer in the first place because it was the only way they could afford to send his mother to college. Although prisons and prison jobs can be a source of trauma to the communities they are a part of, they also allow Adirondack residents to achieve their goals and make their own way in life. In communities that don't have much economic opportunity, for example, prison work can be a source of dignity. But the trauma I've been describing is nevertheless persistent. One formerly incarcerated man with whom I collaborated on a previous research project explained to me that as a resident of New York City, being incarcerated up in Clinton was particularly devastating because it was so difficult for his family to come and visit him. He also gave me detailed accounts of corrections officers overstepping their authority and lashing out at inmates for events as trivial as the outcome of a sporting event. I do not want to ignore this aspect of Adirondack prisons in my discussion of Adirondack communities because it was my interest in the rights of incarcerated people that brought me to this topic in the first place. Adirondack's residents and community members, Adirondack's corrections workers, the Adirondack's working class, they are all part of this too. And despite the ways in which they may benefit from corrections jobs in the prison industry, they are also harmed by prisons as well because prisons are harmful. In an area where prisons have historically constituted a major industry, it is important to consult and collaborate with Adirondack's residents because, as a formerly incarcerated man told Martha Swann of John Brown Lives, unless there is an economic alternative to these CO jobs, there's no chance of dismantling the system. Now, this brings me to the last aspect of incarceration in the Adirondacks that I wanted to discuss tonight, which is Adirondack's activism. Although almost all of my interlocutors spoke about Adirondack's prisons in terms of harm and trauma, almost all of my interlocutors were actively working towards a better future for their communities. For example, Martha, along with John Brown's Lives, created a project called The Correction that explains the Rockefeller drug laws and their impacts on families and community. The exhibition of this project prompted a discussion between one of the presenters and two audience members whose whole families had worked in corrections. John Brown Lives also seeks to lessen the harm of mass incarceration for inmates in the Adirondacks and their families, and has partnered with Harlem's Alliance for Families for Justice to provide support for families visiting their loved ones incarcerated in Adirondack prisons. The Alliance told Martha that the main thing John Brown Lives could do to help their organization could be boiled down to one word: hospitality. Thus, a new function of John Brown Lives is to host families coming up from downstate to visit incarcerated loved ones. One of my other interlocutors, whom I did not mention tonight, as my conversation with her pertains specifically to FCI Raybrook, runs a creative writing program for the incarcerated men in FCI Raybrook that has been in operation for over 20 years. She told me that some of the men participating in her program feel that her program has helped them become more communicative with their families and has helped them become better fathers, husbands, and sons. My interlocutor has also been instrumental in involving the men in FCI Raybrook and community affairs, as she helped organize an art show showcasing inmate art in the Raybrook community. Dr. Hall, whom you just saw present, has told me about various organizations and committees that he has worked with to help make visible the impact and presence of prisons in both Adirondack and New York State history, such as the Adirondack Architectural Heritage, and various steering committees that sought to understand what the Adirondacks would look like without any prisons. Even James's desire to move back to his hometown and improve his community after he finishes his education can be seen as a form of activism, especially in a place where many young people have settled in more economically viable areas of the state. Although many of the excerpts from my interviews, which I've shared with you tonight, criticize many aspects of the prison system and Adirondack communities' economic reliance on the prison system, I think it's important to emphasize that Adirondack residents believe in a better future for their region. And I think it's also important to emphasize that there are many ways to contribute to this better future, whether it is on a community level or a personal level. I can't say for certain what will happen with Adirondack prisons in the future, especially as more and more prisons are shut down and as the prison population declines. I've heard some talk about converting old prisons, such as the Mariah Shock facility, into centers that teach people about the environment and green industry. One thing, however, is clear. The prison industry is not a stable one, and when it goes under, it will impact many. I can't say what will become of those prisons or the communities they have historically supported in the past, but I cannot emphasize enough the importance of collaboration with community members in the future. Thank you. And now I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Alice Green.
Thank you, Anna. Good evening. I'm just so delighted that we're having this important discussion that I've longed to have for so many years. Jeff and Anna have provided vital research and information that is personal, historical, and current. Jeff's book, which I was so happy to read, it's entitled A Prison in the Woods, is so rich with the history of the Adirondacks and its relationship to prisons. Anna must be congratulated for the incredible research she did as a student and presented it as her honors thesis. So I was just delighted that I had this opportunity to have this discussion and also to have discovered the wonderful work that both of these people have done. They've added greatly to my knowledge and understanding of the paradox that I see that has and continues to exist in the Adirondacks. For me, that paradox is one in which the Adirondacks has served as a free and beautiful wilderness for many, while at the same time being confining, punitive, oppressive, and harmful to so many others. My intent this evening is not to lay blame, but suggest that the paradox is worthy of a great deal of thought and community discussion that could and must ultimately lead to transformative action and change that will make the Adirondacks, I think, free, open, and beautiful environment for all people. My perspective on this topic that we're discussing tonight is based heavily on my personal experience growing up as a Black person in the Adirondacks and my life's work as a professional educator, social worker, criminologist, prison abolitionist, and social and human rights activist. I grew up in the 50s and the 60s in Essex County, in the small iron ore mining hamlet of Witherby. My family of 8 and another of 3 were the only Blacks in the town. I learned absolutely nothing in this environment about my African-American history or that of the Adirondacks. All I knew was that we as Blacks saw the Adirondacks as belonging to white people. We were made to feel that it was not our real home. We were thought of as outsiders, strange immigrants, which most of the people in Witherby were, but they were white. And that made all the difference in the world. My siblings and I knew nothing of any Blacks who came before us to the region. We thought we were trailblazers of sorts. We thought we were probably the first Blacks to arrive and settle in the region. Although my father left the South to escape Jim Crow segregation and the growing incarceration of Blacks through the convict leasing system, and he ended up actually in Lion Mountain for a while in the 20s. And our family knew nothing, absolutely nothing, of a prison located nearby in Clinton County that had been there since 1845. It was not even mentioned in the town. But because of my father's experience and fear, we thought of prisons and chain gangs as toxic institutions located mainly in the South. The paradox we speak of soon took shape in our minds. For American prisons at that time were still thought of generally as places to do penance, hence the word penitentiary. They were where white men were confined to learn the error of their ways, correct them, and then return to their white communities as whole rehabilitated persons. But as Jeff has noted, starting in the 1960s, as the Jim Crow system was being increasingly challenged by the growing civil rights movement, those prisons were redesigned and used for a vastly different purpose. Although they were often brutal, early prisons and penitentiaries were seen by many as actually protectors of white communities, but they soon became used as punitive institutions primarily for Black men, not to protect white communities, but inflict harm on those confined there, including their family members and the communities from which they came. This is sort of where I entered professionally after becoming aware of the growing incarceration of Black and brown people and the redesign and purpose of American prisons. White backlash over the accomplishments of the civil rights movement. There was urban unrest. There was the Attica uprising, and of course the war on drugs. And they became justifications for increasing the punishment of Black men through prison confinement. There were calls for more of these punitive economic stimulating institutions that went out, and they were answered by residents and developers in the Adirondacks in New York State. Both Jeff and Anna have clearly documented the struggles that took place around prison construction and efforts to protect the environment in upstate New York. But seeing firsthand the harm and destruction that has been leveled disproportionately against Black and brown people in the land of my childhood, my Center for Law and Justice, which I founded in 1985, jumped into the fray. We actively fought against the development of the emerging prison industrial complex. We called for a prison moratorium and the abolition of prisons. We called for prison reforms and the governmental support for children and families damaged and destroyed by the wholesale removal of Black men from their largely urban communities. Our work was guided by incarcerated Black and brown people who shared their knowledge of and their experience in the criminal justice system and their incredible research into the direct relationship between prisons and communities. Their perspective was termed the non-traditional approach to crime and criminal justice. And the message was that what happens inside prisons regarding treatment and experiences affect the condition of those returning to their community, and also what happens in those communities determines who will go to prison. Their approach demanded that the cycle be interrupted by education, empowerment, and social change. So we at the center work closely with these incredible incarcerated thinkers. They were researchers, educators, and activists, and we learned so much about the impact of the system on individuals, their families, and communities. Their work actually remains very relevant today, that many can still learn from as we struggle with the paradox in the Adirondacks. In our close collaboration, actually, we highlighted the serious economic, political, social, and physical and mental health problems and the debilitating impact of these prisons on Black and brown people. But the carnage continued when in 1997, New York State's prison population reached 72,000, growing from 12,500 in the year 1973, and with most of them being Black and brown people. And it actually led to over 70% of the Black Adirondack total population, that's the total population, which was imprisoned. And people are astounded by this. And it remains today to a great extent, that when you look at the population of the Adirondacks, we're deceived because it looks like this, there are a large number of Blacks and brown people in the Adirondacks, but 70% of all those Black and brown people in the Adirondacks really are imprisoned and with no right to vote. We worked with the families of those in prison who found it difficult, if not impossible, to visit their incarcerated loved ones. We talked to the confined men's spouses, their young children, and parents as they boarded the buses at New York City's Columbus Circle in the middle of the night to make the long, arduous, and exhausting trip to the Adirondacks to visit their loved ones, only to be met often by unwelcoming and hostile Adirondack residents and prison guards and staff who showed little or no respect, compassion, or caring, just resentment and racism. Fortunately, lawyer, educator, and historian Michelle Alexander revealed the serious impact of mass incarceration on Black people in her seminal book, I think it was published in 2010, that must not be forgotten. It is called, of course, The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And if you haven't read it, please do. As we all know, the state's prison population is decreasing. A number of prisons have been closed, and we might see the demise of others. But much of our legal challenges to halt prison construction and other forms of anti-prison advocacy, while not totally successful, help change sentencing legislation, It allowed incarcerated people to be counted as residents of their own home communities. And it reduced reliance on punitive special housing and other practices that were in effect. Efforts are now underway by many to seek new uses of closed facilities, as Anna has just mentioned, that could provide support to environmental efforts. Mariah's Shock, of course, is a case in point. Mariah Town Supervisor Thomas Scottsvalve and others have called for the use of the closed facilities and of that facility and others to train incarcerated people, perhaps, and certainly others to do environmental work. One of the most powerful statements from Anna's research was that, which was made by a formerly incarcerated person, as I remember, who reported to her that the Adirondacks need an economic alternative to correction officer jobs. Otherwise, there is no chance of dismantling the system. Anna's research, Jeff's research and book, and the lessons from the formerly incarcerated people that I mentioned, Michelle Alexander and many others, including the Center for Law and Justice, have clearly documented the trauma, the harm and destruction leveled against individuals, families, residents, incarcerated people, of course, and their communities. Our current incarceration system must be abandoned. Now is definitely the time for environmentalists, government, and prison officials, and Adirondack residents to come together to seriously, and I mean seriously, discuss and plan for the future and resolve the paradox between prisons and the environment that has haunted, harmed, and destroyed so many in our state for nearly 200 years. We must destroy the fear, the white supremacy, and often economic greed that have prevented the beautiful Adirondacks that I now call home from becoming a land of freedom for all people. As with Jeff and Anna, I am also encouraged by the work of individuals and groups in the Adirondacks that are now advocating for social justice and racial diversity in the Adirondacks. But I don't believe that much transformative change can come about until we reckon with the country's over-reliance upon prisons. We remain the most incarcerated nation in the world, and the beautiful Adirondacks continue to be thought of by Black and brown people as prison country reserved for whites. And that's still happening after all these years. Thank you. I would now like to start off by asking a question of Jeff and Anna, and then hopefully we can open it up for discussions from participants. Jeff, I'd like to focus on your strong point that many do not see the exploitation of Black and brown prison labor inherent in the state's prison system that includes, of course, the Adirondacks, and they justify it. So how big a block or wall does this pose for us to really address the problem as we call for social change? I know for many people, the Adirondacks are still defined as prison community. Many people do not want to even visit the area. Many Black people that I've talked to don't want to visit the area. And so I think that's one question. And related to that is that you mentioned that the exploitation must be acknowledged, and of those prisoners, people who are incarcerated who paid the price should be memorialized. And so I'm just wondering how these two things can be reconciled or achieved in an area still very dependent on prisons. Is something else other than the two things that you've mentioned needed to be done in order to move forward to social and economic justice?
Thanks for the questions, Alice. I think I would answer those questions together by just referring to something you mentioned during your remarks, that you grew up in the area not knowing about the history of Blacks in the Adirondacks. You grew up in the area not knowing about the history of prisons in the area. I grew up there too. I didn't know anything about the history of Blacks in the Adirondacks. I learned nothing about it in school. My father worked in Clinton, but my knowledge of the larger prison system in the area, it was pretty scant actually until I started graduate school. So I would say just very basically that we may need to think about rewriting our public school curricula to include local history that focuses on this chapter in area history. I think that that's the first step, is just to educate people about the prison system, and also include the fact that, and this is, I think, one of the big messages that I try to get across when I do these presentations, is that what happens inside prisons is not isolated from the rest of society, and especially in the Adirondacks. So the exploitation of incarcerated people takes on a variety of forms. The labor projects that I talked about, but also, as was mentioned earlier, the fact that they are counted as residents of the places where they're incarcerated, which boosts the local population and is used in drawing legislative districts. So I think that, yeah, I think the first step toward sort of addressing this question about exploitation is just to open people's eyes about the reality around them that they've either been willfully ignoring or that they've just never learned about.
Which is also very difficult now that we're in a period where we don't want to talk about issues around race and the history. So I agree with you. Education is really, really a first step. Thank you. And then sort of related to that, Anna, I mentioned the non-traditional approach that incarcerated people had developed as part of a think tank, and basically saying that what happens inside the prisons is so important that they need to be educated, they need to understand their own history, they need to find ways to become empowered with that knowledge, and they need help from people who are sensitive to, you know, their circumstances. But in your research, you talk a lot about correctional officers being traumatized and stigmatized, and many of them perhaps resentful of the people who were incarcerated, particularly if they're Black and brown. So I'm really concerned about that, because I don't see how positive things can happen inside the prison with a population that does not know about Black and brown people or care about them. And I'm just wondering, how do we talk about that issue?
Thank you so much for your question. It's a really great question. And that was a struggle that I noticed when I was talked to corrections officers, where a lot of their job, and even though many of them were grateful to have a job, especially a job that offers benefits, was still very challenging and traumatic for them in a lot of ways. And I think one thing that is really important to point out is, as I mentioned, corrections jobs are really good jobs for people who specifically don't have education beyond a high school diploma, because usually, especially if you have a family and you want to be able to have those benefits like healthcare, dental care, eye care. Corrections jobs are very appealing. So I think an issue, as you mentioned, many of these corrections officers don't know Black history or about even the history of the role of prisons and in New York State. And I think that Jeff's presentation did a lot to expose what we all don't know about the role that Black and brown incarcerated people have played in New York State history. So I kind of, to build off Jeff's answer, think that there needs to be a different way of talking about some of these issues when we talk about history and when we talk about New York State history. And I also think that it's important to emphasize the need for education for all and quality education for all, because many of the corrections officers that I spoke with told me that many corrections officers don't have higher education or didn't have quality education growing up. And you mentioned how important it was for incarcerated people to also know that history and learn about their own history. So I'm going to totally agree with Jeff here and say that there needs to be an improvement in the way we talk about these things, and also an improvement in the way we distribute these things and this knowledge that we have to the kind of people who need to hear it.
Right. And we're still, we're in a situation where, as far as I know, there aren't any correction officers of color up there, unless they've hired some in the last month or two. They just aren't there. Many of the incarcerated people had to do their own work in terms of educating. It's very, very, and also they were able to bring people like me and other people of color into the prisons so that they could teach them and work with them and collaborate with them. And I don't see how that can happen in the Adirondacks. I know that the people who are now working that you mentioned, the writing classes and all that, those are very, very helpful, and supporting families is very, very important. But I don't know how we get past this problem of the prisons primarily, used for Black and brown people, and the correction officers being white, and it continues to look like enslavement, and that's what so many people say. It looks exactly like it. You tear families apart. Race is an issue. You're exploited economically. I mean, it has all of the features of chattel slavery from earlier period. So unless we can get rid of that stigma, I just don't see how we're going to have the kind of change that needs to happen. I want to remain hopeful and optimistic, but it's very, very difficult knowing what we're dealing with.
Well, thanks so much, Alice, Anna, and Jeff. I know we're a little bit over time, but I still wanted to get to a couple audience questions and comments. We did have one comment, just wanting to let the panelists and the rest of the attendees know that Anna's research and Jeff's book fits into the history of U.S. prisons as depicted by historians David Rothman in The Discovery of the Asylum and Estelle Friedman's Their Sisters' Keepers. And a nice comment that, in addition to the research that is presented by Jeff and Anna, that all this stuff should be required reading in academic programs and Adirondack community schools, libraries. So a couple quick questions here. Do incarcerated men get the choice to do this work, or are they forced somehow to do it? For whoever wants to address that.
I mean, I can just jump in and just say very quickly, officially it's voluntary work, in line with the text of the 13th Amendment, right, to the US Constitution. I mean, that's the legal foundation that these programs are built on, which allows the state to pay the men a very small nominal wage. But because of the restrictions in the 13th Amendment, they can't actually force the men to do the work. So officially it's voluntary.
Yeah, I'm glad you added that officially. Oftentimes it's not seen that way, depending upon what the issue is and the need in a particular community, you know, so,
Right.
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the
I was
fact
going
that
to say,
they're not
sorry.
paid very much to do it, it's slave
Mhm.
labor.
Mhm.
I just wanted to get to one more question quickly here. Is there anything unique to the way Adirondack communities benefit from prison labor that sets it apart from other communities or corporations that derive benefits from prison work performed in other areas of the nation?
I can speak to this a little bit. So one of the things that is very similar to the ways that Adirondack communities benefit from prison labor and ways that are very similar to many other parts of the country is that a lot of times prison and the prison industry is replacing a previous industry. And this is very much the case also in regions such as Appalachia, where prisons have replaced the coal mining industry. And in fact, many prisons in Appalachia have been built on top of old coal mines. And this is very much the case in many regions of the Adirondacks too. And Jeff talks a lot about this in his book as well, where a lot of times communities did welcome prisons as different industries such as iron mining, or in Raybrook, where I did my research, the healthcare industry were in decline. Maybe Jeff, you could say a little more about this.
Oh,
It was a topic in your book.
Thanks, Anna. And those were really good descriptions you provided. I guess what I would add is just that I think what makes it different for me, and I've read about similar developments in California and Texas and other parts of the country, is that there seems to be an effort to conceal the pervasiveness of incarcerated labor in the North Country. You can actually trace this over time. If you just look through local periodicals from start in the late 1970s and go up to the present, you can sort of track how the projects that incarcerated people do were carefully covered by local journalists 50 years ago. And look today, that photo I showed of the men fighting the fire 4 years ago, where the fact that they were incarcerated was barely mentioned in the story. So in a way, incarcerated labor has become naturalized to the point where, like Anna mentioned during her presentation, it's almost invisible to most people. And I don't think that's an accident. And you don't really see that. Like if you look at California, folks know that incarcerated people are fighting the fires there. It's not a secret. But in the North Country, there is, I think, an effort to keep it secret.
well, the other aspect of this is, we're talking about public prisons, but I mean, it's even worse in many areas, and not in New York State, but many areas you have private prisons, and the exploitation is even worse in those kinds of settings. So that's just another, a caveat.
I
to
think
this.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
I think one thing that is also very different is a lot of the kind of environmentalist orientation in the Adirondacks. Many of the people that I spoke with when I was conducting the interviews for my research were very passionate about the Adirondacks as environmental stewards. And many of them were hunters, fishers, participated very much in the outdoor life. So kind of as Alice and I both discussed, I think that especially if we're looking at the idea of the prison industry as kind of something that has replaced other industries that have failed, I think that the strong environmentalist attitude and the strong love of the outdoors in the Adirondacks area is something that is very distinct to the region and could potentially be very beneficial in the creation of new industry for the Adirondacks. And especially as we kind of move more towards wanting to embrace green industry. As I mentioned, there was discussion to turn the shock facility in Mariah into kind of an environmental education center. So I think that is one of the things that sets the Adirondacks and prisons apart from some of these other places in the country.
But also where the Adirondacks are. I mean, it's difficult. In many states, it's fairly easy to have access to the prison in terms of the geographic location. The Adirondacks adds is extremely challenging for so many people. I don't even think now you can get there by train. I don't know if they started it up again, but the train stopped running up to as far as Westport, is my understanding. And there's no public transportation to speak of. And that adds another dimension to it, and extremely problematic for so many people. And most of the people who are incarcerated up there come from New York City. So it's extreme challenge for people.
Well, thank you so much, Alice, Anna, and Jeff, for your presentations in this conversation. As I'm seeing in the chat and in the Q&A, I think people just so appreciate having this conversation, bringing some light and awareness to an issue that I think many of you have mentioned is invisible to the average Adirondack resident. And it's conversations like these that I hope will help us to articulate a vision for a better future in the Adirondack. So thank you so much for being with us here this evening. Thank you to you all for attending, and we hope to see you 2 weeks this evening for our next presentation, which will take place on July 12th at 7 p.m. titled Women in the Forest of History, Renderings of Adirondack Wilderness. The link to register for that program is available in the chat. Thank you again to our presenters, and thank you to folks who registered. We hope to see you again. Have a great evening, everyone. Take care.
Thank you for
Bye now.
Bye-bye.